The massive diorama at Warhammer World is pretty big. And it has been a huge inspiration for my own Imperial Palace megaboard. But today we begin a journey to conquer the reigning champion of massive Warhammer boards as we double the size of the Zorpazorp Imperial Palace. Actually, maybe triple. Yeah, once the new section of Undercity is added, probably triple. So what is the plan, Lockie? How are you gonna make this massive board even bigger? Well, if you'll just settle down, I'll bloody tell you. This next phase of the build is all about increasing the playable area in front of the walls. This kind of city sector here, it's in ruins at the moment, sees a lot of gameplay, and I want even more city here out the front so we can have some massive sieges before the gates. But first we need to do a few touch-ups here on the main board and then spin the whole layout around so that we've got enough room to start building the new configuration.
In the last video you guys have watched, this is where we left the build, and now it's time for us to see some never before seen action to get this board finally ready for the first battle report. First we need to seal any gaps in our build to make it all look like nice believable structures and not just chunks of foam and plastic glued together, starting off with our various road surfaces, our plastic tiles joining one another in the bridge over the second trench, and then up on the second gatehouse where all of our foam layers mesh. Then the next big target is our table skirt walls. When walls get made with heaps of interesting shapes, it inevitably opens up huge amounts of gaps from misaligned pieces, so I painstakingly filled these all in with multi-purpose filler. As I'm going to be painting this all immediately, I often bring in a hairdryer to help set the filler. We do not want this to be wet when the primed paint goes down. The plastic road tiles above the wall skirts were in desperate need of some love as they are all offcuts jammed together to fit the space, but with some nice damp cloth to wipe back the excess, I got it all looking pretty smooth. As the putty dries, but before it's fully cured, I carve back in any grout or stonework detail that kind of accidentally gets filled up, and then set it all again with a nice blast from the hairdryer. Then I set up a bunch of trestle tables outside and got to work laying out all the pieces that needed a prime, including a bunch of previously painted parts that had new foam additions or still needed a few coats of primer. After a quick change to my painting boots, up first is the classic dark grey through the spray gun. This is a super fast application and a lot cheaper than rattle cans, plus it doesn't melt the foam, although with a build this big, it still does take a little while to put down. I did about 3 or 4 light passes to build up that kind of grey colour and keep the foam detail showing through. The thinner paint also helps the spray gun stay unclogged, which is awesome for the workflow. Any plastic components then got their prime in the Rust-Oleum flat grey rattle can primer, which I have colour matched the spray gunned house paint to because I'm a clever cookie. So the road tiles, the plastic spires, any plastic details all get a nice coat here. The rattle can primer is super important because it gets much better adhesion to the plastic. The house paint through the spray gun just slides right off the plastic components. Then our final pass is a massive top-down highlight with chalked light grey. This is a super matte light grey paint that creates an interesting kind of concrete stony texture when it's blasted down sporadically on all of our stonework, both foam and plastic. The zenithal angle builds up a lovely starting point for our raised details, which we can then accentuate with washes. Once that was all dry, thankfully we had a sunny day, I dragged it all inside and set up the core structure of the palace back inside the studio. With so many interconnected parts, this has become a bit of a nightmare, but it does get there eventually with the kind of jostling and lining up the pieces. Our only other big color work now is some big beautiful dark gray blue through the airbrush for all of the roads, on the bridges, on the walkways, and the roof tiles on all the little spires, which create such a nice focus point. I cannot wait to see this blue popping against all of the gold layers we'll be adding in the future. Then it is wash time, and this is a monster layer. I used a very simple wash, just Liquitex black ink diluted in water. That's it, no flow aids, no matte medium, just water. And for the reason for that is this wash is going to do some interesting stuff for us. As I slap it down on these road tiles, which have a lot of flat surfaces, the surface tension folds the wash in strange patterns and dries with huge tide marks. I kind of accentuate that drying time with the hairdryer, and it's just an amazing looking effect that adds some much needed texture to the kind of flat plascrete of these epic scale tiles. It's like a combination of grime and blast marks and the old weathered marbling of the huge stone blocks assembled by the mason guilds. On the flat stone walls, the surface tension is broken up by the porous surface, so to create some staining effects, I slap down a layer of wash all over over the surface, and then go back with a more concentrated wash and dump it at volume in certain places to create running tide marks cascading down the walls, and as that all dries, it leaves a fantastic looking effect.
We have, of course, played our very first battle report here on the Imperial Palace over on the Warhammer channel, which I've linked down in the description. But before we enter the next phase of building this mega build, we have to change the entire configuration of the Imperial Palace.
So the big relocation of our time, and this was actually pretty tricky. Setting up the board so all the parts fit together can be a little bit of a pain, but getting it to be also in the perfect spot in the studio to make sure there's enough room for the new board sections and having the right distance around the back walls was a nightmare, but we got there. So let's look at the next phase of this massive build in greater detail. The crux is a massive increase in the amount of generic Imperial City sectors and to add a bunch more Undercity detail and interior details for the palace walls. The style of having tables decorated with city structures and then fully enclosed in massive trenches to hide them completely has been a huge success for the first part of the board, and I'm going to lean into that even more, starting with 2 bridge access points in the lower city. These will connect to bridges that span an L-shaped trench, which joins to an L-shaped layout 5 feet deep, adding another 100 square feet of city sector.
So that is a lot of new real estate, a bunch of additional city sectors that I'm now going to have to build. But I have already made a bit of a start on it back in Australia with the original Hive City Zorpazorp and Petitioner's City layouts.
I began construction on this portion of the board way back in August last year, deciding to build up the first city block of urban structures using exclusively Cities of Death plastic kits. There is a whole series of videos on this build journey if you guys would like to see more of the detail of the process involved, but there were a couple of massive takeaways. When the buildings are this big, they often become rather unplayable, as most of the structure needs to be pretty much fully intact for the buildings to go so high. So I developed a system of attachment for those old kits that glued the wall sections to the floor tiles so that each level became a floor and walls and not walls and a roof like they were traditionally designed, which means, much like any D&D dungeon structure, you can simply pull open a building at any point and the inside is completely playable. I also really love the claustrophobic aesthetic we see in so much of the artwork of all of the different Hive cities in 40k and 30k, the crisscrossing gangways going backwards and forwards through the urban landscapes of the grimdark future, so I built a whole bunch of interchangeable walkways and doorways at different heights and spacings on all the buildings so that no matter which configuration the buildings found themselves in, I could line up all those passageways and get a really interconnecting claustrophobic aesthetic. The other massive issue with towering structures in terms of playability is access from a gameplay point of view. How do models get to the upper levels realistically? I addressed this in the build in 2 ways. The kind of classic bunch of ladders everywhere, but I also put in some stairwells, in this case using some 3D printed stairs that I modified to fit the GW plastic kits, and then a fully motorized and functioning elevator. Yes, you heard me, a working elevator. And I had this dream of making a real motorized elevator, zooming models up and down, so if you want to see that madness, comment down below, although I'm sure that's probably too out there even for you guys. If you're new here and you want a glimpse of my scenery insanity, there's a whole video on that part of the build, which will kind of illuminate that part of my mind. Now, when making such massive scenery projects like the Imperial Palace, magnetizing certain components can be an absolute lifesaver. All the various walls and towers on the palace gatehouse and rampart are prime candidates for magnetizing. I've been magnetizing different parts of a whole range of projects for years, from all the various weapon and equipment loadouts in our Dawn of War Warhammer series, all my Horus Heresy vehicles from tanks to titans, even destructible ruins on my Osgiliath megaboard. but for such a massive project as the Imperial Palace, we will need a lot of magnets.
So we got some help from today's sponsor, the almighty Magnet Baron, because magnets, they just solve everything.
If you need magnets for your wargaming, then look no further than the magnetbaron.com, your DIY super magnet home. Magnetbaron.com have a huge range of wargaming magnets which are super powerful and even have specific kits for notoriously difficult to magnetize models, magnetize movement trays, and magnetize collapsible flight stands for the epic travel wargaming experience.
I challenge you to find a better feeling in all of wargaming than the pure bliss of this moment. Magnetic perfection.
So to score some boss wargaming magnets for all your army needs, hit up the magnetbaron.com, link down in the description, so go and show him some love. The final element of the modular section of Urban City is the ground itself, and I had these lovely Sector Imperialis plastic game tiles from GW, but in their classic 2x2 foot configuration, they're utterly useless for modularity, so I hacked them up into little 8x8 inch tiles so I could isolate the individual pieces of road and building foundation, and then that gave me a wonderful canvas to kit out a fully modular city. So that little part of the project is an amazing showcase of what I would call Technique 1 of our Imperial Palace building arsenal, plastic kit bashing. It's a fantastic method, and if you want to see more of it, go check out all those videos, but it's very expensive per square foot of models created. I could only make those chunks of the city so far because I have so many of the kits lying around from when I was a teenager. So of course I turned to 3D printing for the next section of the build, a monster cathedral structure to function as the centerpiece of this region of the city beyond the gates of the palace, known as the Petitioner's City. Now this huge towering cathedral is also going to have to be super modular so that we can break it up and break it down into different pieces in our L-shaped city streets. So I began to start checking out some 3D files, and my mate Adam from Inferno Hobbies 3D Printing showed me the incredible suite of Gothic City files, the Zone 1 release from Warlayer. If you guys fall as in love with the files as I did, you can use the link below to pick them up, and you'll stand a bit of cash back to support me and the project here on Zorpazorp.
So I mean, this is just a load of 3D prints behind me.
So first up is the foundation, and we need to make sure we integrate this massive cathedral into the city in a way that's very playable. So I decided to have a road passing through the southern end, and I had a couple of Imperial Sector battle tiles left over, so it was time to hack them up with a whole lot of cutting, snipping, and sawing. Then I threw down my masonite sheets and grabbed a bunch of the 3D prints and started mocking up the footprint on this first half of the board to find my position for the roads. These pieces were 2x2 foot squares with the road running roughly down the center, which would have a huge walkway across the road to continue the cathedral structure across the whole footprint while allowing easy movement for troops and vehicles through the huge building. I then attached the first side of the ground floor to the board with liquid nails, beginning with the southern end of the interior cathedral, which will then continue from these two boards across onto the two larger boards to come. I then started preparing our first tower pieces, which would form the structure on the other side of the road, clipping out some doorways, as this area was going to feature our first stairwell system. It's hugely important to me that this massive structure is playable, and that means upper levels must have access, and over here in the tower complex, it's the perfect place to do it. Then it was time to start building up and continue work on the walkways. These will be one large piece that is removable, so I attached the flooring plate to an open-sided octagonal tower piece, and then glued on another tower section with a roof join to become the first piece of our third level. There are a variety of roof prints available from Warlayer. I used a mix of these while combining a bunch of misprints from various printing tests to make a really interesting damaged roofline jutting out from the southern towers over our walkways.
Just a quick shout out to my mate Con's new sort of like social networking app for finding other wargamers. It's called VoxLink. All the links are down in the description. You guys have probably heard me talk about it before. It's awesome. So you want to find games, get on VoxLink, go check it out.
Before mounting the walkways, I built up the foundation on the remaining two baseboards, getting the foam layer to the same height. I grabbed a whole bunch of our most basic building modules, the plain 3x3 floor and the 3x3 floor and wall pieces, as well as a few exterior buttress walls and archways, and began extending our outer wall out from our original two boards onto the new 2x3 boards to try and get an outline of what this full cathedral is going to look like. For the two towers on the northern end of the board, I decided one of them would be fully ruined, which allowed me to save save a bunch of pieces and make the other 3 towers even higher. Time to continue building upwards, so I dived into the second level of the intact northern tower, adding another open face octagon and extending the passageway to then mount an intact roof with a massive hole and then a roof joining octagon piece. Next was the second level of the cathedral on the southern end where the walkways joined the main structure. These pieces were made from some modified wall and floor pieces to create a unique footprint. Essentially, the upper floor of the first level would have not been a fully intact floor across the whole cathedral, but instead a large wraparound internal balcony to give the main chamber on the ground floor some grandeur with a little bit of cathedral ceilings. I slapped down a couple of other upper story modules that sat on our ground floor walls, and then threw in some stairs in the main chamber for another upper level access point, and then joined our northern tower to the other upper levels, extending from the southern structures with a little 3x1 gangway that jutted out over the archway. This will allow all our upper stories to now be connected. Some interior walls on these upper levels created some further interest and also allowed for further modules to be placed on top with greater structural support. I then added stairwells to the ruined foundation of the northwestern tower, giving us a nice access to the upper level in 3 parts of the board. Following on from the stairs, I needed an upper story section for the western side of the cathedral and created a really cool little balcony piece, which creates a nice reduction in cross-sectional area as the building gets taller, which makes for some nice spots for troops to deploy in defensive positions on the western side, and it hints at the style of the once intact building. As this piece was right in line with our primary roof access from the southwestern to northwestern tower, I used some more roof misprints to create the blasted foundation of the roofline. With the upper structures really coming together, it was time to polish off the ground floor and blend the printed structures into the board itself, and you might have noticed that when I was mocking up the foam layer for this board, all of the foundation that was hidden by the buildings was just garbage white and green poly, but the exposed foam elements were the lovely orange expanded polystyrene, which is perfect for carving. So we're going to be using the classic stone carving techniques to smash down some floor tiles. Using a ruler, I marked up and cut in a nice pattern of large flat flagstones, then widened the grout lines with my pencil, depressed the edges and the depths of various bricks to create a nice relief, and then heavily textured the whole surface by imprinting a rocky texture with some scrunched up aluminium foil. Once this was all covered with rubble, it's going to join absolutely seamlessly. So I started this build on Monday morning, it's now midday on Wednesday, just over 2 days, and I've put about 40 hours work in with very little sleep, and she is ready to be painted. The paint job on this was a monster task, and with little time before it was needed for filming back in the day, I went pretty simple, just hitting it with a range of rattle cans, dark and light greys, building detail with zenithal highlights, and then a pass of black on all of the burnt and damaged bits, and then gave all of the flat textures a wash with black ink, and then dumped a heap of rubble all over the piece. Now, looking forward to our Imperial Palace build here in New Zealand, the real value of these pieces is in the modular tile setup. We could either have this entire cathedral structure as one of the kind of arms of the new L-shaped city sector, or break it up into its 4 smaller sections, placing them at the edges of the outer board limits to hint at the city beyond, and then interweave the cities of death structures amongst them for a really varied skyline before our palace walls.
To prepare for all the buildings arriving from Australia, I've been doing some printing here in the studio as well. Now, the big cathedral is just a massive structure that dominates the city skyline, but I wanted a bunch of more kind of small to medium structures to intermingle with all the cities of death buildings and really pad out that city structure. And so these are the Siege of Castigrad files from War Scenery. They've got some fantastic options of intact and ruined options, which I'm going to kind of all kit bash together. So I think those are going to look great. If you want to grab any of these files, they are linked down in the description as well, which is a great way to support the channel. So all of those pieces are going to come together to help bulk out this massive L-shaped layout of extra city sectors that is going to quadruple the amount of space that we can play on in front of the walls. Remembering, these tables are just like an indicator, right? These are going to be heaps wider and heaps longer. I might have to reconfigure the studio again to actually fit all of this, but I am just So excited for how much this extra area is going to add to the gameplay for Siege of Terra games and of course my Skaven 40k Inquisition themed campaign. But there is one more area where we can increase the size of this board even further. Back in Australia, I've already built this huge kind of underground bunker bastion board for the inside of all of these walls and defensive ramparts, which is going to be perfect to just slide into all of the cavities that I've left here for some really continuous gameplay from the top of the ramparts, inside the walls, and then down into the Undercity. And then we'll use a really large section of those pieces to create this underlevel that drops in under the city sectors. Obviously, this is fully encircled. We'll have it off to the side so that it's playable and accessible, but it is going to add a whole extra dimension to this board. So obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done on this first part of the palace, namely a lot of gold, a lot of details, and a bunch more guns. But over the journey of this piece, I've had a lot of comments from people wanting to kind of know where we're going with this, the outline of the whole kind of plan. So I thought this sort of video would give you guys a glimpse into the future of where I'm kind of going with all this. It's been really fun to put together, so I hope you guys have enjoyed it. In the next video, we are modifying the wall of my garage to become part of the build. The Patreon wall is finally going in, which is going to get decked out with banners and statues, the names of all my patrons going right there, built into my garage, which will then be attached to the main board. So if you want to get your name inscribed on the Imperial Palace mega board, be a part of the Zorpazorp build, go and check out Patreon, linked down in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next video.